Take two on a Friday, the summer solstice. Today is the day where the summer officially begins at 9:45 p.m. tonight, also the longest day.
I thought it was yesterday when it was like 104.
I know, it was so hot. But if you hate the heat, just stick around till tomorrow and you'll want a coat again where the high is going to be in the 60s. So,
It's true.
Mara
Snow
Carabello in the
mountains.
house. If you don't recognize his voice, this is John Dougal back in the house, Frugal Dougal. Are you still Frugal Dougal now that you're with the AG, or have you come up with a different catchy
Well, I've been
name,
Frugal Dougal
phrase?
my whole life. My dad was Frugal Dougal before I was even born, but my wife just calls me cheap.
Cheap. So we might call you that today. Well, I'm glad you're both here. It feels like it's been an intense week. Just a lot going on news-wise, a lot of it bleeding over into politics, so we're going to tackle that. Political violence seems to be the theme of this week, unfortunately. I feel like summer we should be carefree, kicking off our shoes, but it is not happening right now. We had the Salt Lake No Kings protest where one person, an innocent protester, there demonstrating was shot and killed. We also had political violence in Minnesota where people were targeted there from the legislative session. And then we've had several other shootings here in Utah that were not politically related but have kind of piled on to everything going on. So I want to start with the No Kings 50-51 shooting. Is that how you say that group, Mara? Does anyone know? Because I think it's 50 states, 50 protests, like one cause.
I've wondered that same thing. Is it 50-51? That's how I
Or is
read
it 5501? That I don't know. I'm
Because,
calling it 50.
I just
I think
call
it's
it
50-51.
50-51.
So there's a lot going on right now that connects in politically. There's a lot that deals with our police right now. We have a brand new police chief in Salt Lake City that's having to deal with this. So, Mara, we had this protest last week. We were talking about it. The feeling was that it was going to be largely peaceful, and it really was here in Utah and across the country. Ended with a shooting. Now that you've seen everything that's happened this week with one person held right now, no charges, the person who actually fired the shots is not there. A lot of people are yelling and screaming for the DA to make decisions. They want the Salt Lake City Police to act. What are your thoughts when you look at all of this, kind of in retrospect, a week later now?
Yeah, it's an interesting, it's a complicated story about rights and ownership. I mean, I think it should be restated that Salt Lake City actually was the only major act of violence in the No Kings demonstrations. There were some late night stuff in a couple of other metropolitan areas, but by and large, people were there to be for, something. Or against something, but it was largely peaceful. In Utah, what comes to mind for me is the challenge with our gun laws, or not the challenge with our gun laws. So what the person who's currently being held did was not against Utah laws. And
with
so
open carry.
Right, with open carry, and with even unless he aims it at somebody, we have constitutional carry in our state that we've reaffirmed over and over again. And AR-15 assault rifles fall under that category of legal as long as he met the mark. Also, interestingly
and
enough,
that's the question. Was he holding it peacefully or something more? And there's kind of been two different stories.
Well, and then here's what's unique about Utah is that several years ago, a handful of years ago, we have a very unique interpretation of the law, which I think is a problem, which is back in the day, you used to be able to defend yourself and your family and your property, and that was the definition of defense. When we went through the era of the Trayvon Martin, one of the waves that Utah rode in its permissive gun laws is to also now have a clause that says, if you feel like I'm in imminent danger, you may also protect me. And I don't like this clause. I don't think.
So this is
I think
fairly
that's
new.
the role of law enforcement. I think you should be able to protect you and your family and your property. But now, if we're in a public setting, there is cause, the Good Samaritan cause, in which I can see, and that's probably what they're weighing also in that these protectors. Now, a couple of things that happened. I wish the police would have said this right away, but they jumped on it pretty close, which is they clarified that these peacekeepers were not working for them, that it wasn't a formal role, that they didn't issue that formality. And it's really important to note that law enforcement never, ever, ever hires backup law enforcement.
Like,
you don't
they're trained,
hire
they do their job.
citizens to help you.
Yeah, I mean, they may get support from other law enforcement officials
But those
in
are law
other
enforcement.
cities, but those
they
are law
never
enforcement, not
tap
private
citizens to give them a solid while they're there. So
Volunteers,
they weren't operating on behalf of the police department. It's really pretty unusual. I don't think that they have charged or looked at the potential Good Samaritans who did this, but the RDA, who I'm a supporter of, is slightly notoriously known for being a little slow, and
Slightly?
he
Yeah.
and he asked for some time to deliberate and look at things. So he did that to us this week and said, "Hey guys, I need a minute to look at the charges. I need a minute to look at the issues." The Salt Lake PD reiterated that they're investigating this and that they're looking at the nuances. They also reiterated that this group was not hired by them, and and then, interestingly enough, the national 50-50 one said, "Hey, listen, we have a law again, or a rule in our
If you're
group
gonna be part of
that
us."
you cannot carry."
Yeah.
So these people were not carrying weapons, but Utah's permissive laws allow for something like this to happen. And in a press avail yesterday with the House, I know that the speaker sort of said he liked where the laws are, but the question has been posed: does this incident mean we should relook at our laws?
Well, and the reports indicate that the individual who was shot, not the one who was killed tragically, but the one who was shot, who was carrying the AR-15, has done this at other marches, other rallies, he regularly open carries.
Right.
And there's one of those things. It's just because you can do something, you should be smart about whether or not it's the right environment, atmosphere for that action. Because, you look at this. Even in the best scenario, okay, you were carrying it peacefully, as your rights allow. Peacekeeper misinterpreted what you were doing, thought you were attacking folks, and then tragically killed an innocent bystander. I mean,
But
that's the best case scenario.
Doesn't that call for a review of the law that says, you bet, don't worry, you want to strap on an assault rifle in public, it's going to make everybody feel great.
Yeah,
I mean, what's interesting too is the conversation I heard is the legislature going to adapt a law that says, which many state capitals have, that you can't open carry at capitals. And I'm like, oh, no. Like, if you think it is not in the public's interest to have certain weapons open carry, it should be universal. You should protect my gathering as much as you should protect anyone's gathering.
And over the years, when I was in the legislature, we had folks that would open carry to committee hearings.
Sure.
And unfortunately, it usually backfired on them in terms of it conveyed the wrong message, and they didn't get the support that they thought they were going to get as a result of their provocative actions.
It's not a good feeling when you're in the room with somebody who's open carrying an AR-15. And I think we've come
But
to
that's
not
what
be...
permissive gun laws are supporting. That is actually the value that permissive gun laws support, is that somehow, even though statistically we know the more guns, the more likely people will be killed. But our laws don't say that. Our laws say, above all, make sure you have a weapon on you.
Well,
and if you're going to instruct that, then you're going to get that.
Right, and I'm fine with the permissive. What I'm just saying is, just because you have the right, you don't always have to exercise it. You may choose, discretion in certain environments. And you may recognize that sometimes your right is not conveying the message that you think you're trying to convey.
You work for the AG's office. Do you know of calls?
But I'm not speaking for
but
the
you're not
AG's
speaking for
office.
them, no. But do you know if there have been calls coming in? Because it seems to me right now there's a lot of people who would like to see the so-called peacekeeper charged, and I think a lot of people are like, I don't even know who I talk to, and what are the laws? Do people call since they think of the AG as the top cop about this, or did this all go through the district attorney?
I'm assuming this is probably going through the district attorney right now, just because it's been out there that he's looking at it.
Yeah.
Various calls come in about various topics in the AG's office. I haven't heard that this is one of those topics right now.
It's his jurisdiction.
Yeah. Before we move on from this, I just wanted to mention that we have pulled or waiting on a grandma request for the permit. We would like to see who applied for it. Did they notify the city that they were going to have these so-called peacekeepers? If they did they say they were going to be armed and what information's in there? I've never actually looked for one of these permits to know what information they give, but as soon as we get that, we'll report on it. One other thing I wanted to talk about
Did the organization invite them, or did they just show up?
I believe that they were invited, at least from the information they've given us. We've been frustrated because they have refused thus far to have any on-camera interviews. They have supplied statements, but we don't really know who they are. We don't know if there was an application process. They did say that these people either had some kind of like military or some kind of gun training experience. Who decides what is allowed? It's hard to say. But I did want to note, too, this was the first time that the new chief had to take a lead role and talk about what's happening. From a PR standpoint, has he been doing a good job, Mara?
Yeah, I feel like he has. I feel like he's pretty open and communicative. I mean, Heidi, you would know as well. Did you feel like he's been informed? I still think we have a slight, and I expect that he'll correct this, but we've had several years of SLCPD being virtually impossible to talk to in person. They still have this kind of funky process where you submit instead of talking, but Chief Red's very good about communication. I think he highly values it. I liked that we saw him. I think in instances like this, you need to see the leaders of organizations. I like that he gave instructive statements, that he was like, here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm looking for, here's what I want. I don't like the guise of I can't disclose to the public because it's under investigation. I think that is not necessary, and we've seen police departments who disagree with that. That is not necessary in the criminal process. It's a choice that I think people are making, and I hope more and more our PD doesn't choose to say, I can't tell you because it's sensitive. I think that's a red herring.
Yep.
But I think he's done a great job communicating. I like that we've seen him. I do think this is an incident that requires some unpacking. I mean, it feels like it makes sense to me that they're saying, okay, we want to take a minute. I will say I'm looking for follow-up, and you know this better than I, but it's the hot incident, but it's also the tactic of when we look away, do you still, as a public trust entity, do a good job keeping us up? Like, you guys should be getting briefings. You shouldn't have to be, the press shouldn't have to be pushing for additional information. That's the real test of, are you being open with the public? Do you continue to put out information when you have it, or is it always the press that has to grandma? Is it always the press that has to continue? And I don't think we know that yet, but I think so far the PD did a nice job.
Yeah. John, when you look at this, a lot of people want to know the name of this person who fired the deadly shot and killed someone. Do you think this is something that should be out in the public purview, or does that create the problems of this political violence when people who are mad at whoever it is go and try to go to their home or go after them?
I think right now it needs to be something that's left to the police department to go figure out and investigate. You put out somebody's name, and you may be unfairly tarnishing them. I mean, if there actually was a shooter, rather than people condemning this peacekeeper, they'd be celebrating this peacekeeper if he had protected from a violent event. And that's where right now there's a lot of conflicting information of what really took place, what did he see, what happened. Clearly we know somebody was tragically killed as a result of this interaction. But I think right now this should be up to the police to investigate and then report on what they find. And then at that point, people can determine whether or not somebody's name should be released.
He hasn't been charged, and he's been working with the police.
Yeah.
And he's not at risk, right? Those are the assessments you want the police department to make. Like, is it in the public interest to know who this person is right now? And this is an uncharged citizen. So I like the caution that they use. If I were an uncharged member of the public, I would appreciate the discretion of the police department in not releasing my name before I had a public charge.
Yep.
Or if I didn't ever, I like the idea that I wasn't a part of a public conversation.
And we have to remind people, too, a lot of people think they've figured it all out because they've seen a few videos.
Sure.
Police always have more than what we can see, whether it's been submitted to them. They know what was inside of his backpack. They know if he'd written a note or if he had other things in his car, with threats, or talked to friends to know if he did open carry on a regular basis. So we will wait to see what happens. Hopefully we'll get more answers from the district attorney on Monday. Looking more at political violence, there are concerns here in Utah and really across the country right now after these targeted shootings in Minnesota, where a former House Speaker and her husband were killed. 2 others were shot and hospitalized. A bunch of others, dozens more on a hit list. We were talking about in a podcast not very long ago when Representative Ryan Wilcox was here right after the legislative session. I was surprised by him. He said that they had to step up enforcement for members to go to their kids' basketball games, to go to doctor's offices. you work up at the Capitol, John. You know that
I used to be an elected
there's
official for
concerns.
22
Yeah.
years.
And not so many years ago, just a few years ago, the only person who was protected was the governor. The lieutenant governor was not protected with the Utah Highway Patrol services. But now I understand.
Just the occasional thing here or there.
Yeah.
I can remember several years ago during a legislative session, Senator Bramble had, I think, a security detail for 3 days or something like that. So there are occasional things here and there, but not on an ongoing basis.
But now it seems like a more real threat that's ongoing. State taxpayers are going to be paying for this. Is this a concern that you feel working up at the Capitol on a daily basis?
I didn't really feel it at the Capitol per se, but I felt it more at home as a result. You know, when you get death threats and folks saying they're going to hunt you down or whatever it might be.
Have you received those?
Oh, yeah. I've received death threats over the years. It's one of those things, you know, having that discussion with your spouse, your wife, saying, you know, okay, here's some issues, here's some threats, here's some precautions we should be taking. And you never quite know. Is this just somebody venting in words, but they don't mean any action, or is there going to be action behind it? And then you look at this tragic event, you know, in Minnesota, or tragic events, actually, when you look at them. This is one of those, unfortunately, today, an underlying concern of many elected officials. Doesn't matter if it's city council to governor to president, whatever it might be. It's, okay, we have entered a world where we think violent attacks is much more appropriate against elected officials, and you know, when is somebody actually going to act on their agitation or their verbal threats? And so that's a concern. And so when you see right now, as Representative Wilcox talked about, the governor clearly has an ongoing security detail. The lieutenant governor now has an ongoing security detail. And what I'm told is anywhere from 4 to 5 legislators on an ongoing basis have some type of security detail as a result of the threats they're receiving. And that's just sad in terms of political commentary of what's going on, not just in America, but especially here in Utah.
Yeah, and I think that it seems like it's been getting worse and worse to me, at least since the pandemic. And I feel like sometimes once you go down that road, Mara, it's hard to rewind and go back. But it just seems like even though we're shocked when these things happen, that we're like, oh, that happened again, which is sad to say.
Yeah, culture changes are really hard, and it's time for us to change our culture. And it's time for us to recognize and start talking about why we're predisposed to violence, why we're ratcheting things up. And the first step to doing this in the land of politics is to stop saying, well, they did this, and that's why I did this. We've got to go back to being humans. We've got to go back to recognizing that individuals are working hard, even if they disagree with you. And we do need to stand up to people who are participating in snark and violence and us and them. And the rhetoric changes. John and I disagree easily. Like it's
on many stuff.
I mean, but it's not stressful. It's not
Mara
tense.
told me I'm wrong.
Even if it's heated, it's not tense. But I don't say he's evil, and I don't say, and he doesn't say.
No. Mara may be the opposition,
it.
but she's not the enemy.
Right, but that's what that's the tipping point to violence. And speech matters in this. Getting off of social media, not reinforcing a violent culture. And I do think we have to talk about access to weapons. And I think that often violence begets how it happens. And we do have to all take responsibility. I think that it's really important that our elected officials feel protected. But when the conversation ends at more security as a solution instead of how do we stop getting people to the point where the only option they feel like they have is violence, we're not being. America is an unduly violent nation, and until we get to those causes, but in politics, it is not the fault of the lawmakers, but we have to understand that there's a direct call and response between the elected officials we have and what we ask of them. And if we ask for character and we ask for decorum and we ask for problem solving and we give them room to make hard choices, they will do that for us. When we ask for tribalism, when we ask for anger, when we ask for cheap and easy us and thems, then we're going to get that as well.
Which brings us to the next topic. Senator Mike Lee, he's been having a rough week, partially because of the choices he's made. If you follow him on X, if you don't, he's on there a lot. He tweets all day long, or what do you call it now? You post on X, but a lot of times he's just kind of getting into the political conversations, talking to people online. Irreverent sometimes. This time, definitely a lot of people are calling for his resignation. Others people say he needs to apologize. Others are like, it was a joke, let's move on. But after the shootings in Minnesota, he tweeted a couple posts of the guy that was in the silicone mask, which was scary, no doubt, and the suspect here saying nightmare on Wall Street. Mara, we're talking about these civil conversations. When a sitting senator does this, is it a problem, and is it a time to self-reflect and say, okay, we need to change the way we talk, or is it just a stupid post and we should move on?
There are 100 people in the United States of America who get the honor of being a U.S. senator, and it is a position of trust, and position of trusts have responsibilities to be people of character and good examples. And again, do people of character disagree with each other? They do. Are they fallible? They are. But Mike Lee has now had a history of irresponsible content on social media that is unbecoming and unworthy a U.S. senator. And so I don't believe that the process is that I'm calling for resignation, but I will tell you, if this is the only person that shares your values and also represents your character, I would suggest that I work with a lot of Republicans, and I can give you some names of some people who would be better. I think for me, Senator Lee has become Washington, has become a political beast, and the calculation is always a political calculation. And what was so shocking at this moment is that someone had just died. This was a moment in America, whether it's 9/11 or whether it is anything. We don't care what your party was. We don't, two people had died, but we don't, at that moment, we always had in the past rose to the occasion, right? Like if you cannot put politics down at that moment, then I believe that you've lost your bearings and politics have become the goal, not character, not doing what's right for your community, not trying to make the world a better place, which is why I think most public servants get into the business. And then I think they become professionals. I will say a shout out to the Minnesota senators who resisted the urge to name call. They confronted Senator Lee. They had their moment with them, but Klobuchar said, hey, listen, I'm going to talk to him, and I'm going to be frustrated with him, and I'm going to say this, but I owe him this conversation. And what was at the heart of their objections was, I'm in a time of intense pain, and your response was to add to this pain. And who are you and what are you doing? I don't want it to be missed that I am optimistic enough to not give up my hope that in addition to being elected, you will also have the courage to be a person of character and a person of humanity. And I expect still that my leaders are held to a higher standard. And Senator Lee failed to meet this mark at every step along the way, including his refusal to apologize.
Does he need to apologize, or should he just move on at this point?
First of all, I'm going to say, I think from my perspective, this is a nightmare on anybody's street. To think that somebody's going to come up at 1 or 2 in the morning, knock on your door, pretend like they're the police, and shoot and kill you as the elected official and your spouse. And they went from house to another house to another house, killing 2, injuring 2 others, but as reported, went to 4 houses. And so I look and I say, okay, there are times to be witty, to drive change in Washington, D.C. This was not the time from my perspective. I think an apology is appropriate. I think it's necessary. And I think we also need to move on and hope that he learns a lesson of when is the right way to engage to fight against the overreach and the problems with the federal government, and when is there times to recognize the tragic humanity of the situation and respond appropriately and caringly in that time of heartbreak for so many folks.
And I think we all recognize that there's need for wit and laughter sometimes, like to break through the stress of situations. This time certainly wasn't it.
No, you are a sitting U.S. senator.
Yeah.
This is not a member of the public.
It.
This is not my 18-year-old who is still trying to distinguish right and wrong. This is not a judgment call. This is 100 out of 100 people know that this is not the time to take that action. This is These are United States senators. I refuse to think that there's a spectrum of decision making at this moment. And I'm infuriated by us, all of us collectively getting so used to moving along. I'm not suggesting that anyone here just did this, but we have to have stops where we go, this wasn't a person. This was a sitting U.S. senator who doesn't have the judgment that you need to understand that when there's a political assassination, you don't make fun of that. I don't have to explain it to any of my kids. None of them. I never had to explain that to my 10-year-old kid. Why? Because that judgment level is not compatible with being one of 100 people who make decisions in this country. And I'm not saying his name, but at what point are we going to insist that we have people of character and judgment in these positions, and that is as important as whether I'm 10 for 10 for you on your policy statements? And I think this is part of the problem that we're grappling with in America.
Yeah, and I think one of the frustrations I personally have is I've been really busy in the last few weeks and have been waiting for kind of a breath where I can talk to our senators and some of our congressional leaders about where we're at in the budget process with the big, beautiful bill that hopefully will get ripped into pieces and passed into smaller portions. I have a lot of questions about that. I have questions about a new bill or amendment that Mike Lee has on lands. But because it's happening when he's not wanting to talk about these tweets or apologize, when I'm trying to get through to them and trying to book an interview, he doesn't want to talk about any of these things because then you're on camera and,
right,
this could be asked too. And so now we're at a point where he's probably in a waiting period where he's going to wait until he feels like it's safe to do those interviews. But there's an important conversation going on that he has started that I think's kind of been out there for a little while, but Senator Lee...
Well, it's been out there for a long time.
Yeah, and actually, if you look back to the election in November, both Harris and Trump were in favor of the concept of what he's pitching right now, that maybe some of these federal lands get sold off and used it for housing. So I think it's an important conversation to be had to talk about what these lands are, how they could be used, how this bill's going to work, because the actual wording hasn't been out there. But we can't have this conversation right now because he's not doing interviews and his people aren't answering questions. So there's proposed sale of millions of acres of public land, and most of that public land, we all know, is in the western United States, where here in Utah and other states, the vast majority of our land is held by the federal government.
About 2/3 in Utah.
Yeah, a lot.
About 87% in Nevada, just to put a number on it for folks.
And this bill is looking at 0.5%, if I understand it correctly, that could be sold off. Depending on who you're talking to, it could go to the highest bidder. It would go to the states first, and they could have the first right of refusal. When you look at this issue, as a Republican, are you saying, okay, there's some wisdom in this, or are you looking at the way that some of these conservationists are and saying, okay, this is stupid, this is where our wildlife lives, this is where we hike, this is where we go out and have the great outdoors, and let's not wreck this?
So from my perspective, this is a bill in the right direction. I mean, the federal government controls too much of Utah, and I come from the perspective, whoever controls the land controls the economy. And too often that means the federal government is controlling the economies in city after city, town after town, county after county throughout the state. When you look at the numbers, Texas is about 3% owned by the federal government. Utah is about 2/3 controlled by the federal government. There is a lot of public lands that can be divested, put to other uses, and still have massive amounts of this state for fishing, recreation, hiking, camping, whatever it might be, multiple uses of that public land. And we can have both from my perspective. And so this is an important discussion. And I think some of those environmentalist groups are stirring up, falsely claiming the bill does all sorts of different things, where really what the bill does is create a process whereby communities can go through to start to identify what are certain federal lands that could be sold off in small chunks. You can't have one group come in and buy it all up. There's certain constraints on that sale process. But when you look at the settling of the West, historically what would happen is the federal government owned the land, and then there was homesteading and other things like that, and the land would be sold off. And yet when they got to the West, to places like Utah, they stopped the process. And I think it's improper. Personally, I think it gets on the verge of unconstitutional how much control the federal government has of Utah lands or other western state lands.
So the distribution of land existed when we made our state. So it's not a surprise. It wasn't like, what? When did this come from? So we agreed to it when we made
Brigham
statehood.
Young was pretty desperate at the
Well,
time.
and remember, Brigham Young was breaking the law and not acknowledging the federal system. So, so that it has always existed. And two, I think it's really important that we note that this issue is not a Republican-Democrat issue. It actually has... it's one of the rare ones that doesn't break down on party lines.
Yeah.
It's about philosophy, particularly when it comes to the sale. Protecting lands, maybe not, but this issue is not a partisan issue if we're talking about the tribes of the Republicans and the Democrats. The other thing is that there's this widely held mantra that goes over and over, is that if the government owns the land, then it's blocked off for all of our use. Nope, that's not true. We're talking about whether you want a condo on that land, not whether you can use the land. So to be clear about when we speak of sales of lands, many people who are for selling the land act as though it's out of use and then it gets put in use if you want it. No, the question is, do I want a condo on that land, or maybe I want to hike or bike? But we know the answers to how Utahns feel, and we know the answers to how the western states feel. There's a poll that happens every year. It's happened for dozens of years. It's a rare poll that I love because Democratic pollster and a Republican pollster always jointly do it. It's a longitudinal poll done by Colorado College. It comes out at the first part of every year, and it's focused uniquely on Western issues. And they ask this question because, as John pointed out, this question's been around for a long time. So the 2025 results of this poll show that 82%, again, this is a bipartisan poll, 82% of us believe that you should build more housing within or close to existing communities near jobs, roads, and transit, as opposed to the 14% who believe that selling some limited areas of national public land should be used to developing national areas. When you go and read this poll, you will see that they outlined essentially the essence of this bill. It was very specific to this bill, and 82% of us said, nah, this is not how we want to develop this land. So if someone's telling you they're representing the West, and if they tell you they're representing Utah, and in this poll, you can go to a Utah crosstab and find out and Utahns were just like anyone else, I suggest that this doesn't follow what the public wants. And I suggest that while there are limited tracts that are being bartered and swapped all the time with the federal government, the Constitution does not prohibit any of this, and we swap lands all the time.
School trust lands. And
and we redesignate, and
we've seen a couple in Las Vegas recently
to jurisdiction. The state swapped out lands, so we have that ability. This is specific to, do you want to develop it for housing? And also remember, this was rejected by the House, and the House is much more strident. And it is because it is not a partisan issue. This is an issue of how you want your lands. Do you want them open for everybody to recreate, or do you want to sell more land to developers?
One interesting move I saw, and at least Senator Mike Lee we know is listening. He was on the Glenn Beck show. That's one place he has been in the last week talking about this bill and saying that they might change it where it would only be land that was within 2 miles of where you have other, neighborhoods, buildings, or communities going on, which I think might change the conversation if you're knowing that you're not going vastly out into the ranges of where you're not already.
The conversation in southern Utah is around water and proximity to access to major water thoroughfares, if that's valuable for who to do it. But this land does take away the rights of federal government, which most Utahns say huzzah, except that in this instance, the feds are the ones that are protecting these properties.
It gets to, if you will, arches. Okay. People think, oh, they're going to sell off arches. Heaven forbid they're going to put a condo, in your words, right next to it.
Ooh, right under an arch? I would love that. So
Nobody's
gorgeous.
talking about that.
Yeah, but John, nobody is talking about that.
But all of a sudden when it's, okay, here's this federal land right in between this housing development in the middle of a city. Oh, yeah, no, that probably makes sense to sell that off and develop it.
Yeah, and you don't need this law to do it, right? And you don't need the writing of this law. So if you're being genuine about having this not be a wholesale regard of how we're managing land, there are current laws that would allow us to take small tracts. This bill that Lee is promoting is not needed to get to where people want to go. This is a permissive bill that likes the states and the local jurisdictions to take over larger swaths of land management.
And so I think, to your question, it's a good idea and it's an important policy decision to go down this path, and it's being misportrayed. And I appreciate the Senator working on it.
All right, Senator Mike Lee, if you're listening, we would love to have this conversation, so give me a call. You've got my cell number. Talking about a couple other things happening this week, the Supreme Court's handing down their rulings, two of them going in favor of the state of Utah. We have an EPA ruling and a transgender surgery one. Are we cheering for which one? EPA?
We're cheering for both.
For both.
Yeah, the EPA one.
So let's
probably the lead.
Yeah, let's start with that. So that was an 8-0 vote. One of them sitting out on this, but this was the U.S. Supreme Court siding with Utah and Oklahoma. This case came down on Wednesday. It started over disagreements with the Clean Air Act and evolved into a debate over where certain lawsuits could be heard. They were getting sending to Washington, D.C., as opposed to more central courts to Utah.
Yeah, so what Utah was arguing, Oklahoma, is this should be heard in the 10th Circuit, the local circuit for appeals, not going to Washington, D.C., which is kind of home court to the federal government. And so that was the argument. Now the Clean Air Act and stuff like that, this is where the various states are concerned that the federal government is overstepping what's going on, and we should be able to challenge it in court. So while it sounds like it's mundane, that it's just about what circuit that we're going to hear it in, I think it's a critically important issue. And I think showing that 8-0 shows, this was something that the court easily agreed to.
Yeah, this is the veracity of process, which makes sense. I like that the Supreme Court said, yes, we have a preference for a local jurisdiction. What to not confuse it with is a ruling on the veracity of the EPA.
No. This is about
absolutely about process and where to hear it. And I don't know, as the 8-0 decision, I don't know many people who aren't saying, that's nice. I like that we're showing a deference to local district courts.
And I think this, while this is on process, I look at the Uinta Basin Railway and the 9-0 case there about, NEPA's been weaponized.
Yeah.
And it was stalling the project, which is critically important. And folks had gone through the process, they'd gone through the hoops, got challenged, and the Supreme Court in that case also ruled and said, no, they complied. Build the railway.
Yeah, very similar philosophy in many instances.
Yeah, Utah's been winning in this session, and I'm not sure if we have any other cases out there, but another one this week was on transgender surgery. The case that actually went to the Supreme Court came from Tennessee, but this is a state that most Republican-controlled states have some kind of legislation in the last couple of years over bans on transgender surgeries for youth or for minors. In a majority opinion on Wednesday, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that Tennessee's ban does not violate the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, which requires the government to treat similarly situated people the same. Mara, your thoughts?
I mean, this is going to be very troubling for minority groups who would have, from their view, seen progress on the definition, the modern definition of equal protection. So I think this is absolutely a setback for minority groups in the trans community who were trying to seek a foothold legally within these classes.
Basically, where this is coming at is an argument of, is this gender discrimination that requires a heightened standard to say whether the government can have this law, which means oftentimes the law gets tossed out because it's such a high burden that the government can't prove it? Or does it have a lower justification, rational basis? Is there a rational reason for the government to have this? And that's what this court said is, yes, the government just needs a rational basis for this kind of law dealing with minors in this kind of surgery, especially because for various folks it's considered still very experimental, very uncertain about the effectiveness of the surgery.
The Pediatrics Association would disagree with it. Is it experimental and uncertain? Just to be clear, the science shows it to be safe and effective psychologically and physically. It is a hot political topic, and it is a very much family values topic. So I fully recognize that it is a hot values-based topic, but the science is not unclear about it.
The science is unclear. When you look internationally, England had a study on this and other places
there
like that.
There are boutique studies, but the American Pediatric Association is not unclear on this.
Well, I'm just saying, clearly the court thought it was, experimental, and it was
no, they weren't ruling on this. They were ruling on gender definitions in class. You said it well the first time. They were not opining about their feelings. Again, often
Chief
the
Justice
court
did opine in his opinion, and said it should be left to the states to figure out.
Right, but that's not opining on gender. He's talking about jurisdiction.
No,
and
he
again,
was also talking about the uncertainty of the issue and having it resolved.
on process, not on his opinion of the issue. The Supreme Court is very good about differentiating their opinions, which the politicians don't. But to be clear, this was a clear process problem, and it set back those looking for footholds for the trans community for sure. But again, to continue to conflate the political argument with the science argument isn't helpful for us.
Yeah, the American Academy of Pediatrics definitely has sided with families that want those surgeries. Interestingly enough, I've heard other doctors talking about too, which gets away from what the ruling was on, is that your brain really does develop till you're 25 years old. And so that's part of the thought process people are talking about of whether your brain has figured out.
My challenge to that is we are number 2 only behind Orange County for plastic surgery in the United States. Utah is.
It is wild.
And so
I
if
thought you
it
were going to
is
say
not,
going to Disneyland.
no, but if we're talking about how physically using surgery to change the way you look to comport with your expectations of who you are, whether that's beauty and your breast size or your nose size, or whether that is how you view yourself from a gender perspective, there has to be an acknowledgement of a bit of hypocrisy for a state that's number 2 for plastic surgery, including for kids under 21 years old, and then they can't even fathom a world where a trans kid wants a surgery. So, I mean, we have to dig a little deeper on what we're talking about is social engineering and our values around our community, which is what our agreed social contract is, right? I understand that that's the definition of
we
politics.
got to be careful if we're talking minors or adults. I mean, clearly the court
Right, but
also
we
said
don't
there's a
apply that
difference.
for plastic surgery. We're still okay. You can co-sign your kid if you feel like she needs to change her appearance to be more beautiful from a beauty standard that a magazine has presented to her. You're just not okay with it if the kid wants to comport the gender that they feel like they're in the inside. We have a double standard there about surgery and how you manifest your look as a minor.
Utah is very Hunger Games in that. I remember when I moved back to Utah 14 years ago, and I would argue that probably the rates weren't as high for plastic surgery. But moving from Florida back to Utah, my brain took a while to keep up and look at all the people who, there's so much sameness with plastic surgery going on here.
We
that
do
I
have a
was
lot of
just
pretty
like,
people.
Yeah, I was like, what is happening? It just, your brain is like, wait, this is not natural and this is not normal, but
Thank you for the
this is what we're doing.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
You're
Did I miss
welcome.
the
That is
compliment? What
correct.
was it? My
We
brain
have a
was
lot of
thinking something else.
beautiful
Yeah,
people.
look at all these gorgeous
Pretty
people
Look at all
here.
of the beautiful people.
Yes, I know. So, an interesting argument. Do we have any other cases that we're waiting to come from the Supreme Court that I am not realizing are
I don't
on
know
the
the
docket?
answer to that question.
Because there's been 3 that have been very Utah specific so far.
The redistricting one.
Yeah.
It's not Utah's case, but I think a lot of folks are going to be watching what happens with the redistricting case out of, I think it was Louisiana.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I think that's a big one that we're going to be watching as well. I'm hoping that things kind of simmer down just a skosh over the summer months. We usually take a break in July and the first couple weeks of August. When I said that last year, that's when Biden dropped out of the race, when Trump was shot at during his rally. Yeah, so a lot was happening in the summer when we usually say, okay, let's take a chill pill. So I'm hoping that we can take a chill. We've got Speaker Schultz coming in to talk a little bit about what he's been up to post-legislative session next week. But I'm hoping that after
There
that...
ain't a chill pill there.
Yes, I know. There's no chill going on.
He's an Energizer bunny.
Yeah, what are you hearing on the streets that's happening behind the legislative session?
You've got just the ramp up of interim sessions and all the discussion that takes place during the summer in preparation for next year.
And we've already talked about this, but like new leadership, right? In the House, not in the Senate. And so which
Jefferson
is
Moss
usually
stepped
a
down and-
sleepy time, they had leadership elections a couple weeks ago. And so they're going to be gelling and figuring out, what the 4 of them are about for the upcoming session.
And nationally, I know President Trump was hoping that on the 4th of July that he would have his big, beautiful bill. I don't think that's going to happen. Is there anything else that you're
Independence Day,
watching?
baby.
Yeah.
Independence, not 4th of July.
Independence Day.
What we like to call No King's Day.
No King's Day.
The official and original No King's Day, yes.
They've posted a new round of No King's marches for that day. I noticed that the No King's movement is going. So
I'd like to just point at the history. I think it was George Mason, one of the founders, was upset about the Constitution because he was afraid the president would become an elected king.
Interesting.
Okay, so this is going all the way back to when the Constitution was being debated.
Yeah.
Rolling forward. So this is, whether
Come
it's
full
Trump,
circle.
whether it's Obama, whatever, we have concerns with presidents exercising too much power.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember concern about Obama going for an unconstitutional extra term.
You don't remember the pictures of Obama with the crown on the front of the news magazines
don't
about
recall
Obama being a
him
king, about his pen and a
asserting-
phone being able to executive order
Well, I
this
mean,
and executive
if
order that.
executive orders were a concern, Trump's blown the doors off of that. I think we're talking about actually suspending the Constitution with Trump. So he's raised to the bar for kings.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Although all the talk of an extra term, I mean, the Constitution has not been changed. That's not going to happen. But it is interesting how this does kind of resurface Obama for different reasons. But yeah, when you go Google, you see, with the cover of Time and other things where they have a little lopsided crown on him. So the official No King's Day coming up just in 2 weeks. Can't believe we're almost to Independence Day. So I'll be watching. I'll be interested to see if Salt Lake City participates in these now that they've sort of been cut off from the 50-51 group, or if they will continue down that road. So
Now, remember, there were 19 in the state of Utah on that day. There were big and small. They were everywhere.
they were everywhere. And most of them, I mean, for the large part, we saw a little standoff in St. George where two groups were there, but peacefully kind of fighting amongst themselves until the sunset. But they all seemed to be fairly upbeat. I did hear a little Hamilton, You'll Be Back song was sung in the crowds.
Oh, come on. The book was better.
The book was better. So we'll be paying attention to all of that as it happens. And if there's breaking news, we'll try to regather and discuss it. But we will be back next week with Mara and the speaker to talk about all those important issues. Thank you so much for being in here, Mr. Frugal Dougal.
Always a
and
pleasure.
Mara, always great having you here. Thanks for listening. And we'll be back again next week.